On behalf of the Task Force on Nature Markets, I want to say that we are really pleased to be co-hosting this event with Nature Finance, with Terrazos, and with Pollination. And before explaining how this session is going to work, because it's going to be a very dynamic session with multiple debates, I just want to say a few words to help frame why we convened this discussion and the critical role that we see for properly governed nature markets in helping address the nature and climate crises right now. So over the past 18 months, with the support and participation of many in this room, Nature Finance helped to convene a task force on nature markets, which brought together leading experts from around the world to help us think through the evolution of nature markets and the risks and opportunities that they present for achieving more equitable and nature-positive outcomes. The task force concluded its work in August and launched its final recommendations in Belém in the Amazon. A key headline emerging from that report is that we are witnessing an unprecedented upswell of nature markets, where nature is finally being priced and integrated into the global economy, whether through asset markets for land and water rights, the development of nature credit markets and nature insurance products, the integration of nature-related risks into financial supervision, or the development of sustainability-linked debt instruments. We really are in the midst of a historic shift in the way that nature is recognized and valued across the economy and financial systems. A key thread running through the work of the task force is that the rise of nature markets really does represent a kind of double-edged sword. So there is a world where these markets could be an enormous boon to sustainability efforts, could help reverse catastrophic biodiversity loss, could help address climate goals, could help reduce inequality. There's also a world where the rapid financialization of nature could lead to a range of really perverse impacts, from greenwashed efforts that end up having little to no biodiversity impact, to a deepening of inequality and further marginalization of indigenous and local communities, amongst other risks. So our interest here today and going forward is to help ensure that the rise of nature markets really helps steer us towards more equitable and nature-positive outcomes, and not the dystopic version of the sword. So we believe that to achieve this will really require nothing short of a governance revolution that involves everything from digital technologies to citizen action to legal innovations and more coordinated governance mechanisms within and across countries. In this vein, the task force has come up with 7 recommendations to ensure that nature is consistently and effectively integrated into individual markets as well as the broader economy. In our discussion today, we're just going to focus on several of those key topics emerging from these recommendations. To kick us off, I'm delighted to be joined by Joan Manda, who's Senior SDG Advisor to the UNDP Africa Sustainable Finance Hub. She's going to share her thoughts with us on a range of topics related to nature markets, including the shifting geopolitics, especially as they're being experienced on the African continent. And then we're going to have a series of 3 debates on nature credit markets, food systems governance, and the role of central banks and supervisors in integrating nature and climate. These are going to be real debates. Having been part of the prep conversations, there is legitimate disagreement, which I'm really excited about because I think that makes for a really interesting session. These are going to be quick 20-minute lightning round style debates that will undoubtedly frustrate us all because we really should be devoting days or weeks to talking about these topics, but hopefully we give you at least a teaser of some of the key headlines and debates in these areas, and hope that you will look to the TNM report and look to the exceptional work done by our debaters and the organizations to learn more about these topics. After the debates, we will hear from Jose Pugas, who's the head of JGP Asset Management, one of the largest asset managers in Brazil, to offer some of his reflections on the future of nature markets in a context where we are seeing Brazil really step into a major leadership role with its new ecological transition plan and shortly assuming the G20 presidency. And then to close us out, we will hear some final thoughts from Andre Hoffman, who is also a member of the Task Force on Nature Markets. So with that, I'm delighted to invite Joan up onto the stage for a little scene-setting chat.
so everything is fine. You could hear for a few seconds. You could hear her. So what I will do is, as soon as we are done here, I will mute myself, and you will see again the program.
I don't think that was us.
I don't think that was us either. I think some wires may have crossed. Hopefully you can hear us. Hi, Joan. Welcome.
Hi, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're very happy to have you. So just to kick us off, we are fresh, or not so fresh, many of us from New York Climate Week. And prior to that, the Africa Climate Summit. So I'm really keen to hear some of your impressions in terms of kind of the geopolitics of nature markets right now, and where you feel like we're seeing leadership, where you feel like we're seeing tension, particularly from the perspective of the African continent.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Joanne Manda. I'm the Senior SDG Development Advisor in UNDP's Africa Sustainable Finance Hub. And I did attend the Africa Climate Week and the Africa Summit itself. And some really strong leadership emerging from President Ruto there in terms of setting up the summit to start off with, and having a strong, maybe even hard-nosed conversation about the importance of inclusion in terms of developing the solutions that we need for the climate change crisis. And I think his main point was saying that while climate change is a global challenge, we need everybody on the globe to work together in order to find the solutions that make sense for everyone, as opposed to maybe the flavor of the climate negotiations around North and South and that kind of dynamic. And I think that shows an indication of where the African continent is moving, recognition that we can develop the solutions that we need for the challenges that we're facing. I think also recognizing that the bulk, maybe well over 70% of jobs, livelihoods across Africa depend on nature. And so it's important that we include those people in coming up with the solutions for it. I think there was a lot of conversation also during the Climate Week around, making a financial system that's fit for purpose, and wanting to make sure that, we are driving capital, whether it be public or private, but particularly private capital, towards the areas where it's needed the most. And I think that was a very strong point that was made there about, how do we make sure that we are deploying our capital in ways that will result in better impacts on nature, on climate, and that will also address the issues around inequality. So some really interesting emerging leadership coming out of the continent at present.
That's great. And just building on that, and this idea of making markets fit for purpose and the governance architecture required from that, we've seen a lot of really fast-moving developments in that domain, most recently the launch of TNFD, for example. Also new policies coming out, like the deforestation policy in Europe, and prior to that, the carbon markets adjustment mechanism, border adjustment mechanism. How is all of that being received on the continent? And what do you think are, we could take TNFD as an example, kind of some of the prospects for uptake or some of the areas where you think it needs more attention in terms of making the case?
Well, I think players on the African continent are not naive. I think it's important we watch the global, the emergence of global dynamics and frameworks. The EU's taxonomy, for example, has been an area of great debate and conversation. And I think the issues that sort of arise when we are having conversations with the countries that we support as UNDP is around how do we make some of these global aspirations context specific and appropriate for the context in which many of our African governments are functioning. A lot of what we do as UNDP is capacity building, technical assistance around strengthening institutions, and with our role on the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, really engaging at a local level and trying to identify the institutional frameworks that make sense for the local context, but are interoperable with sort of global frameworks. So the conversation is around that. One of the studies that we did recently in South Africa was to do an institutional and policy review of the institutions in South Africa with regards to how ready are they to meet the requirements of TNFD and other framework. And, South Africa is quite an advanced market for the continent. And so it gives you a good sense of, where things could get to and where they ought to be. And yet we still found that there was a lot yet to be done in terms of building capacities of both, the financial sector itself, very conservative, still not quite pushing that envelope of ESG beyond just a risk mitigating tick box exercise, and I say that advisedly, but not pushing that far into real practical, tangible indicators and reporting on sustainability at that level, but also making sure that there is sort of coherence across the full ecosystem, so from the financial sector to supervisors, through to regulatory institutions and so on, and getting all of that sort of institutional architecture put in place. And that's for South Africa. Yeah. So you can imagine some of the challenges that you'll be facing in other sort of African markets as well.
Absolutely. So I have one more question before we let you go and move on to the debates. I wanted to ask you about some of the equity dynamics involved with nature markets, and specifically, I think we've seen this a lot with carbon credits, carbon markets, and we are hearing it more and more now around biodiversity credit markets as they develop as well, the inclusion of indigenous people and local communities, and when we talk about localizing and making finance fit for purpose, sort of what role those communities and broader stakeholder participation has to play in the evolution of nature markets. Just any observations you want to offer about those issues?
Great. Well, first of all, I think I'd say that we don't really have the option of continuing to ignore nature as part and parcel of the business structures and business, the way in which we run business, right? So that's critical to remember. We also don't have the luxury of continuing to go, well, that's an externality in my business model, and maybe someone else is picking up that cost. And when it comes to inequality, we're starting to see this in the spate of political and socioeconomic issues happening across Africa, where we really need to start opening the door to having conversations with the communities that actually are the guardians of nature in many ways. And so this is becoming a huge issue right across the board, whether you're talking about access to energy or whether you're talking about communities getting properly compensated for the kind of work they do in sustaining natural ecosystems. So I think there's space to open that door for a conversation and identify the kind of financing structures that are designed for equity, and having some hard-nosed conversations with the big sort of foreign direct investors that come into the country as to what are they doing supply chain, value chain wise, and how do they bring those alongside with them. And there's always a good space to have that conversation, in terms of how we can use the larger enterprises to kind of bring alongside the small and medium enterprises that we engage with on a regular basis. Final piece will be really around regulation and making sure that those are also fit for purpose.
Yeah.
I know it.
That's a brilliant segue into our next session on nature credits, where we'll get to talk about some of these dynamics more. But in the meantime, thank you so much, and please a round of applause for Joanne for sharing her thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I could invite Mariana Sarmiento from Terrazos and Mark Opel from the Campaign for Nature up on stage to join me and kick off our debate on nature credits. And we're going to have a seat. However you want to align yourselves or space yourselves, up to you. So I'm going to invite each of you, starting with Mariana, to share some initial thoughts on the question at hand for the session, which is what role should nature credit markets play in financing biodiversity, and on what terms?
Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm Mariana. I'm the CEO and founder of Terrazos. Terrazos is a Colombian company, and we've been doing biodiversity compliance credits for the last 7 years, and in the last 2 years, we repackaged some of the compliance credits to create voluntary biodiversity credits. So with that as a background, the question is why biodiversity credits and what for? And if we tie that to the 30 by 30 goal, then it's to preserve biodiversity and maintain it and restore it for the long term. So how can biodiversity credits do that? And what we've seen in the compliance market, or in the compliance scenario where we have a biodiversity compensation law, is that biodiversity credits can accelerate finance into good projects that are delivering outcomes where you wouldn't have national parks, where you wouldn't have, or where there's an impossibility to have state-led conservation activities, and also where carbon markets don't work because the ecosystems are not particularly high biomass, don't have very much biomass, but also because the landscape is very fragmented. And for those of you that know carbon markets, that's a limitation. So biocredits not only can accelerate finance into this, they create possibilities for rural development in areas where otherwise they wouldn't exist, and they're complementary to carbon markets. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Mark, over to you to share your initial thoughts, and then we'll have a conversation between the two of you in response over the next 10 minutes or so.
Great. Well, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Mariana. And I'm Mark Opel, and I'm the finance lead for the Campaign for Nature, and we help lead the efforts to have the world adopt the goal of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. I was in this building 18 months ago, starting the negotiations of what was ultimately agreed in Montreal with the Global Biodiversity Framework and the adoption of the goal to protect and enact 30 by 30. First, thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion. It's an important one. And Mariana, congratulations on the good work you guys are doing. I think we share a commitment to getting measured results and funding protected areas with long-term funding. My perspective that I'll share today briefly is, it's informed by 30 years in the private sector. I spent 18 years in private equity and another dozen years elsewhere before working in conservation. Just for definitional purposes, we think of biocredits as voluntary and additional and not offsets, and I think that's an important distinction that's consistent with a lot of the reports that we've seen coming out. And we've got lots of concerns about biocredits, and what we're here to talk about today. I'll start with just three, and we think an attempt to try to define what a biodiversity credit means globally is inherently flawed. That nature's not fungible. Nature's not meant to be traded, and you can't make something fungible that's inherently not fungible. And I think biodiversity credits have the potential to make things more complicated. You can always fund the good work that Mariana and others are doing on the ground by funding the activities and the people and the programs that underlie biodiversity credits. So, and there are tons of opportunities now to invest in those without needing biocredits. Second, we think that biocredits actually increase the opportunities for greenwashing. There's a lot of greenwashing going on now. We think biodiversity credits can actually enhance that. Everyone has been reading the kind of constant drip of critiques of the carbon markets. Biodiversity credits suffer from all the challenges that carbon markets have, plus some. I think if a company can't use a biodiversity credit as an offset, you have to ask the question, why would it buy it? And I think we have to be very sober about how far voluntary efforts on the part of companies will get us. Jeremy Grantham, well-known investor and conservationist, said, we must not expect unnecessary good behavior from capitalists. It takes regulation. We see that in all of our work. Finally, and maybe most insidiously, biodiversity credits can enable government magical thinking, that somehow the private sector is going to come to the rescue of providing the financing for the Global Biodiversity Framework. If you're not familiar with it, it identified a $700 billion a year gap. Why do we think that it enables government magical thinking? Well, the UK and France have convened a panel on biodiversity credits, a global panel, and instead of starting with any other target within the Global Biodiversity Framework, $500 billion of subsidy reform is called for in Target 18, $200 billion of additional financial resources. They started with biocredits, and we think that's a problem. It's a problem because there's an opportunity cost to anything that we pursue, and it's a problem because we really need to focus on the things that are going to meet our biodiversity finance goals, and that is increased government funding and changes in government policy that will drive the private investment that everybody here is talking about.
Thank you so much, Mark. I told you this would be a real debate. So, Mariana, would you like to offer some thoughts in response?
It's fun. Where to start? So again, it's a $700 billion problem. The estimates that we have in terms of what the potential of biocredits could be can be between 1 billion and 7 billion annual market. I agree with you, it's just a sliver. But it's a new solution, and it's a new toolkit that could add to that. I agree with you that we are distracted from that big goal. So why is there so much noise regarding biocredits? I don't know. That's a good question. Where are the powerful NGOs today trying to target that $700 billion problem and instead kind of trying to kill the new kid on the block in a way and not even given a chance, for it to succeed? We don't have the first $100,000 worth of transactions in biodiversity credits, and yet people are already killing it. So, having said that, what we do know is that the private sector will be investing in biodiversity because of TNFD, because of what their interest groups are going to demand, and what we need to provide is a tool so that they can do it effectively. We've all seen, and we talk about greenwashing, how many CEOs like to take the picture planting the tree? What happens to that tree? A biodiversity credit can actually be a way in which they make a contribution, they look good, but it's actually a long-lasting investment or a long-lasting contribution. And here I want to connect it to what's a biodiversity credit, right? Because it might be, I don't know, if people have everybody here understands it. Whether you call it a credit or not, what is it? It's an outcome. It's a pay-for-success mechanism. And it's a pay-for-success mechanism that must reflect an ecological outcome, but that must be permanent in the long term if we want it to actually help us meet our goals. So when we talk about biodiversity credits, and if all of you are thinking about biodiversity credits and people are talking to you about it, it needs to be technically rigorous, so we need to make sure that that outcome reflects ecological lift, but it also needs to in some way or another reflect financial sustainability of that project that is issuing those credits. If a credit only allows the project to survive 5 years, which is the case of actually many of these international programs that we see that kind of come out every 5 years, then we haven't done anything. And then finally, it needs to be socially and legally permanent. How do we make sure that these projects create 30-year outcomes or or in perpetuity? And what that entails is that we need to make sure that any biodiversity credit system is aligned and is meaningful to the people that are on the ground. That what we're measuring is something that people understand. That what is being done is aligned with their way of understanding development. And if we can get biodiversity credits that can capture that, we've done something that the conservation community has not been able to do in decades, which is how do we get the money on the ground and get verifiable outcomes that we can all kind of look to.
Sorry, Julie, but Mariana and I have more in common than it might appear. We both, I think, feel that the environmental community has failed in the past, for the most part, to deliver quantified outcomes. And what you often get in reports in the environmental community are activities that are kind of proxies for outcomes. So we totally agree of the need for long-term, quantified, actual measured outcomes in a robust way. We just don't think you need biodiversity credits to do that. There are some great programs that are happening right now, available for funding for anybody who wants to make a contribution, whether it's a company, a philanthropist, a corporation. Things like the Legacy Landscapes Fund, which is a private-public partnership between Germany and a group of philanthropists that is providing long-term funding to protected areas around the world and getting measured outcomes. Two other examples, just to say that we can fund the activities underlying credits without credits. The Clarify Fund, if you want to get money to the indigenous and local communities, Clarify Fund is accepting contributions right now. And finally, you may have seen at Climate Week, the island state of Niue in the Pacific announced ocean conservation commitments. They're selling the protection of 1 square kilometer of a marine protected area over 20 years for $150, 250 New Zealand. And they call them ocean conservation commitments. I think part of where we struggle is this notion of credits and what claims a company can make when it buys a credit. We're happy with commitments.
So I really want to open up to questions, and I'm putting Helen Crawley from Pollination on notice that I'm going to come to you first if you have one. But before we do that, Mariana, I want to give you a brief chance to respond to this question of why not instead just go the route of lots of voluntary CSR contributions and philanthropy into conservation projects?
So maybe some data to help kind of, in Colombia, for example, second most biodiverse country in the world, we're going to be 70% of the population lives in a highly fragmented ecosystems that are highly vulnerable, and that will, highly vulnerable to climate change. 30% of land tenure in Colombia, similar to other countries, is private. How do you get private owners who own land, which is critical for climate change adaptation, to change land use practices? There's no protected areas fund that can enable that. And if 30% of the land coincides where 70% of the population lives, you need instruments that will incentivize private landowners to change land use. And here's an alternative. We've done that. We have 8 projects. We've been able to change land use from cattle grazing, super unproductive cattle grazing, to 30 years of conservation commitments. So we need tools like this, and none of the other tools that are out there are able to deliver on that.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions. And Helen, who also happens to be a co-host and just got off an airplane, I believe, would you like to make a few comments?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, sorry I'm a bit late. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of this. You want me to stand up? Okay, thank you. Hi. Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, I've been in this business for conservation business for 35 years, and it would be great if philanthropy could fill the gap, but it hasn't so far. And I think we need something compelling for new types of finance to come in. Now, there's certainly lots of challenges, there's no doubt, with building the integrity and the governance. I don't think anyone's arguing that. And I don't think even anyone's perhaps arguing whether credits is the right name for what we're trying to do here. But I will give you three things about biodiversity credits thus far that I think is making it a really compelling case for new types of finance and new interest in supporting conservation and restoration. And the first is that the way we're doing it is about the stock of biodiversity. It's about not the flows, it's about measuring and tracking that important high integrity functional systems and the net gain in building that functional system. And that's really important. We haven't really had that before. We've had carbon markets that are just sort of financing a flow, an ecosystem service. So that gives a whole new focus on what we're trying to do here and getting people to understand about high integrity and what high integrity and functionality means. The second thing that's really important, I think, about the way biodiversity credits is evolving, and by the way, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think we have a choice of whether we want to back biodiversity credits or not. It's moving so fast. I think we have to get behind it and make it work. But that's a different discussion, I guess. But the second thing that I think is really important is that you can use the credit methodologies across a range. You can use it for high integrity systems and functional systems, and you can use it for restoration and uplift. So you can cross a whole lot of different biomes and different land use types. So that's really good too. And the third thing is the thinking and all that work, all that academic research, all the thinking about how you track and measure biodiversity is coming together in a really exciting way around how you define what a credit is. And there'll probably be several definitions. But that's all coming together hand in hand with tech to track and to monitor. So those three things together create a really exciting and compelling case for biodiversity credits that I think we really have to pay attention to and help support a high integrity market to get that. And it is perhaps potentially the vehicle for a just transition when done right. Thanks.
Oh. Can I respond to that?
Quickly, I'll
Briefly?
let both of you respond with 1 minute each, and then we're actually, unfortunately, going to have to move on to the next debate.
If you look at the data, over 85% of all funding for nature comes from public sources. There's no reason to think that voluntary measures on the part of corporations are going to get us anywhere near to closing the biodiversity funding gap. It's still voluntary. Companies are not in the business of giving away money. At the end of the day, they account for less than 6% of all philanthropy in the U.S. So giving it another name isn't going to make voluntary contributions any more compelling than they are now. Until they're required, until there's a regulation, until public policy changes, creating biodiversity credits is not going to fill anything close to what Mariana said is even already a very small potential to closing a $700 billion gap.
Mariana, you have the last word.
I agree. We need strong levers to promote and to encourage and to demand private sector investment in biodiversity because our economies depend on nature. Everything that we have is because of nature. And so we need a way to democratize, that's the term, biodiversity conservation. And credits can do that. And I will make a pitch now. You can buy Terrazos credits for $20. And the reason why we say this, how we got to the number, I can go into that later if you want, but it's how do you create products that are accessible to everybody, that a small company can make its contribution, that a medium company can do it, and that a large multinational corporation can also do it in an easy way and something that really reflects an outcome. And that's what I believe is the power in biocredits.
Thank you so much to you both. A round of applause for our panelists. Brilliant. I'm going to invite Matt Inmush on the stage, who's joining us from WBCSD. And do we have our remote colleague? Great. So we have Stephanie Betts from Ann. I think there's
I think we're all connected.
an echo. So maybe mute when you're not speaking so we don't hear me talking twice. Brilliant. So this next debate, fabulous, is going to be on the governance of food markets. And we're going to follow the same format as last time. We'll turn to you first, Matt, to kick off with some initial comments for around 3 minutes. We'll turn to Stephanie, and then we'll invite you to have a conversation with each other, sort of responding to each other, and then open up, hopefully this time, to a few questions.
Sure, thanks. So I'm with WBCSD. I work in our... It's going to be tough.
Stephanie, can you mute? Are you muted?
Yes, I am muted.
I don't know why we're hearing that echo. You think it's a mic thing? Okay.
You okay?
Yeah, good, great. Go for it.
So yeah, Matt Inbush. I work with WBCSD's Ag and Food team, and I work on Nature Positive specifically. And yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'll give a quick plug first, and then I won't overdo it. But we've just published a set of Nature Positive roadmaps, including for the Ag and Food system, which is what I've been leading for the last year or so. And it has a row crops commodity focus, actually. So that's, I think, relevant for the discussion today on soft commodities. So give it a look if you're interested. We'd love to take feedback and keep improving as we go. So I'll put that out there. But a lot of my comments today will kind of revolve around the themes from that roadmap. And so we're talking about commodity markets, accountability. I'm not a finance guy, so I'll count on all of you to sort of translate this into what it means for the financial community. But working with big corporates, which is what we do, and working with a big network of partners, I think about, I guess, kind of the outcomes that we're aiming towards, the process to get there, and then some key themes that should, I think, inform that. So big picture outcomes are based on the GBF, I think probably pretty obvious, the Global Biodiversity Framework. The nature positive objectives coming out of that, which are to halt and reverse nature loss now, more nature, especially in a local context, by 2030 than we have today, and then full recovery by 2050. How does all that translate down into the local level, I think, is the question for nature positive as a sort of as a movement. But then the process that we really are endorsing and aligning our work around is Act D, and you may have heard that mentioned in some sessions today. This is also Business for Nature is promoting this heavily, and it's essentially the 4 steps that we are aligned around to promote a nature positive future for global corporates and for all companies. Very quickly, the A is assess, so materiality. What are your dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities as related to nature? Pressures within your value chains, where you operate, where you have influence. Start there, because that really needs to inform the rest of your nature positive approach. And TNFD, sector guidance in particular that's forthcoming, is going to be a really key, I think, tool for sectors to do that really well. Lots of tools that already exist that are more technical, like Encore and IBAT and many others that folks are probably familiar with. But that's assess. C is commit, so this is around target setting, and I think the sort of leading edge of that would be SBTs for nature, right? Science-based targets for land and freshwater, which are now out for market use and market testing, but it's still pretty early days. So our emphasis is that we should all be pushing towards that and helping to improve that framework as it progresses. But there's a whole lot that companies of all kinds should be doing up to that point in that direction. So we shouldn't see that as a limitation, but rather a sort of a path ahead. Which translates then into the T, which is transform. So what are those priority actions that companies should be taking based on their materiality assessment, both within their value chains and beyond? And then how does that translate, I guess, to the financial sector is one question here. D is disclose, and that's where most of the attention, I think, has been from the FI community. So TNFD, CSRD, all of the acronyms that we know very well, and really essential to have that transparency along the way. I think the thing to remember is that the D in the framework, the D wraps around all of it. So it's not sort of the final step. It's something that needs to be transparency and reporting and accountability based on that needs to be happening all the way from that assessment to the target setting and reporting through to the actions and then the disclosures. So maybe I'll stop there for now and talk about the themes in the next portion.
Great, thank you. Do we have Stephanie? Okay, great. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. Do you still have an echo? Will you not?
No, you're perfect. Go right ahead.
Okay, it means I think I used to be on double screen, that's why. Thank you very much for your kind invitation, and I think it's going to be really interesting because hopefully we can link back also to the previous panel that you just had on biodiversity credits. So I'm Stephanie Bates, I work for Aon, I'm part of the climate team, and I'm head of Alliance, Coalitions and Reporting on Climate. My previous life was as a corporate lawyer specialized in disclosures. It's quite a nice natural fit. And I think what we're seeing here is an unprecedented time where you've got an evolution, a rapid evolution of technology, but also a rapid evolution of the legal context. And we needed obviously to have progress in terms of framework when it comes to biodiversity, but I think that we are going to see some movement very rapidly. And I think for insurance and insurance at large, for the sector, we have to ask ourselves, how can we shape behaviors in order to limit systemic risk? Because this is really what we're talking about here. And I think the penny is starting to drop. It's taken some time, that actually nature has to trump climate. And a lot of disclosures are still very much focused on disclosure carbon footprint. Nature is starting to make its way. Obviously, a number of companies are now reporting under TNFD and planning to report under TNFD. A lot of companies are reporting on CDP, which is what I meant to say. And we are seeing a lot of progress there, but not fast enough. And I think there's an element there's a need for collaboration between, organizations such as at MATS, ourselves, banks, and obviously large corporates. So this is really where we see things happening and changing really quickly. So going back to how we can build resilience in the system, it seems to us that we need to look at two things. We need to look at actions and outcomes, because when you're looking at the ag sector in particular and farmers who are, as the previous panel said, the guardians of our ecosystems, we need to find better ways to support them because they're facing all the risk at the moment, but with very little support. And some of the outcomes of their actions will take years to come, but we need to support the actions right now. So that's really the sort of, these are really the themes that we're working with at the moment. And we're trying to engage as much as we can with large corporations that are very dependent on their supply chains, because climate is obviously impacting them in terms of volatility, in terms of risk, in terms of the supply for the raw materials, etc., but also in terms of transition risk. So I think there's a real drive here for large corporates to really pick up the mantle now and actually really start to act on this, even while the regulator is still finalizing, frameworks and various regulations around the world. So I would expect to see the private sector to really start to harness this, based on the dual pressure from CBAM, which is coming, and TNFD, which we expect to become mandatory within the next 2 years. So that's probably enough of a setting for me.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And maybe because I was warned before this session that the two debaters actually agree on almost everything, just to provoke with a little question here, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on how one approaches a sector where it would be a wonderful thing if we had a very high volume of many corporations and financial institutions taking up new disclosure and reporting mechanisms, but there's also a very small handful of very large commodity traders that exert outsized influence in this space, and many of them are not publicly listed. And it's been a real challenge to engage with and sort of get greater transparency and insight into their practices, let alone get them to disclose things like profits and data around their impact. So how do you both think about the role of that handful of behemoths in the context of making progress in food systems transformation?
I'm happy to take this, Matt, if you want to.
Sure, go for it, and I'll follow on.
Brilliant. So I think it's the elephant in the room. Of course, there's a lot of still greenwashing and a lot of companies trying to think that there'll be a better day to start looking at nature and how they're impacting nature. But I think what's changing now is there's a level of transparency that technology is not allowing, and it's a little bit like before and after the internet. There were lots of behaviors that were probably fine before the internet came on the stage, but now you can't hide anywhere. And I think this is what we're going to start to witness. And in particular, I want to allude to satellite data, but also edge computing. So it's the combination of satellite data and AI, which we think is going to be transformational for these particular issues, because it's going to be much harder for companies to hide what they're doing or not doing, and it's going to be also a lot easier for the good citizens to demonstrate, so to really have, demonstrable impact, if you want. And I think the way we'll close the loop on this, of course, we're going to need some bold early adopters, people who are happy to carve a path on this, and because they understand the systemic risk, but they also understand the risk for themselves, both on the physical side and on the transition side. But I think we'll close the loop here once the consumer is actually put in charge of also making some of these decisions, because they'll have a set of, labeling, if you want, on everyday products. Because for the moment, companies can do a lot of work, but they don't really get rewarded for it by the consumer. And I think that leaves a really big gap for greenwashing, because consumer is unaware of who's good and who's bad. And I think once we can solve that problem, it will hopefully make a big difference rather quickly, because if people, vote with their feet, I think we will find that a lot of these behaviors will no longer be acceptable.
Do you want to add any comments on that?
Yeah, again, I think we're pretty well aligned. Not much of a debate, but what I would add to it is the policy piece, and I think that's a big theme here for today as well. So, public policy needs to underpin all of this to really move the needle. And just as an example, so the roadmap I mentioned for the agri-food system is actually based on 3 deep dives that we did, looking really deeply into 3 different productive landscapes around the world, and walking through that ACT-D process that I mentioned, and doing a really deep materiality assessment and set of priority actions. One of those is the Cerrado in Brazil, which is, as folks in the room probably know, is a huge biodiversity hotspot, stores a massive amount of carbon. It's also on the leading edge of conversion and deforestation risk, and it's one of the biggest soy producing regions in the world. So kind of right in the middle of all of this. And we looked at that landscape as part of these deep dives. And one of the key things that came out of it is that there are these sort of priority actions that can be the unlock for everything else around nature positive and food and ag. And no surprise, it's deforestation and conversion-free production that has to happen in that landscape in order to really move all the other pieces. And so things like financing, consumer pressure, the EU deforestation regulation, because these traders are big exporters, namely, all that comes together and creates the pressure on the big players, and then the idea is that it trickles out to the whole system and that it becomes the norm. But I think that local piece is really critical when we think about the role that FIs play and the landscape approach as part of that. So I think you can make a good argument that you can be doing lots of really good regenerative agriculture work around soy over here with cover crops and no-till and all the good practices. But if you're still clearing land to expand soy production over here, you can't really look at that as a nature positive approach. So I think that landscape approach, whoever the stakeholder is who's pushing it, needs to be embedded really deeply in how we think about nature positive.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, and I would say, Matt, if I may say, we also need, obviously, when you do these initiatives locally, you really need government support. So I'll just give a quick example of one of the big projects we're working on. We're working with the African Development Bank at the moment to see how we can help move the whole of the continent towards regenerative agriculture by finding both donors and larger food and bev companies that are actually willing to invest into insurance to build resilience of the farmers, but also looking at a system of biodiversity credit to compensate for their efforts and to give them an additional revenue flow. And I think here we found that having the backing of someone like the African Development Bank and therefore of the local government makes a huge difference, because suddenly you can move a lot faster and you can move at scale.
That makes sense. So I am being told that we do not have time for questions. The frustration I mentioned people would feel is the frustration I am feeling right now, because there's so much to discuss here. So let me just thank you very much, Matt and Stephanie, for your insights, and a round of applause, please, for this round of debaters. Thank you.
If I can, final thought is just we got to get moving faster. This stuff's all messy. It's inherently complex, but we just got to get going. So
We're going too slow.
that would be my final thought.
Let's work
Excellent.
together.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And last but definitely not least, I'm going to invite Alexander Barkawi, founder and director of the Council on Economic Policies, up on stage along with Judson Berkey from UBS, who will be debating the role of central banks and supervisors around integrating nature and climate, both in terms of current mandates and potentially sort of expanded vision of what the role of these institutions is in addressing climate and nature crises. So same format. Alex can start with you, then Judson, and then go back and forth. Maybe we'll have time for questions. We'll see if third time's a charm. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Julie. Thanks a lot for having me. I'd like to touch on three things in relation to the topic. First, why do central banks and financial supervisors need to act on nature and climate considerations? What is it that they should do, and where do they stand? In my view, there are two key reasons why they must act. One is pretty straightforward, and one is more open to debate, but I believe when we examine also that second reason a bit more closely, it also is a pretty clear-cut case. The straightforward reason for central banks and financial supervisors to act is that nature loss and climate change pose financial risks. And accounting for financial risks is at the core of what central banks and financial supervisors are tasked to do. And I would argue ignoring financial risks is essentially ignoring the core of their mandate. The second reason is that finance affects all aspects of our lives. Whether we succeed in creating economic opportunity, strengthening social cohesion, protecting nature, is intricately linked to financial flows and thus also to how we choose to govern the financial system. And we just cannot afford to have political institutions that are as powerful as central banks and financial supervisors to say, don't talk to us, we do price stability, and to be completely oblivious to the broader agenda that we're pursuing. This does not mean that central banks and financial supervisors become environmental policymakers. It does not mean that central banks should not retain price stability and financial stability as a core objective of theirs. And it also doesn't mean that we're expecting them to be the silver bullet that solves everything. I'm saying this because one of the pushbacks we hear from central banks on these topics is, guys, if we do this, all the other policymakers who need to act will not do anything, and therefore we also don't do anything. I think that's a really weak argument. I think it's really not where we should go. So it doesn't mean all of these things. What it does mean is that central banks must be cognizant of the broader objectives that a society has and must align with the policy priorities that result from that. So just quickly, what they should do, I think. And I'll stay on the minimum, just taking that risk perspective, not even going towards the broader policy alignment. At a minimum, I believe central banks and financial supervisors must account for every financial risk that they're exposed to or that the banks that they supervise are exposed to, including obviously the financial risks that stem from climate change and nature loss. And to make that concrete, that includes for central banks to account for these risks in their own balance sheets, when they purchase bonds, sovereign bonds, corporate bonds, when they purchase equities, as does the Swiss National Bank, for example. It includes accounting for environmental risks when they define what collateral banks can provide to them when they seek refinancing from the central bank. And it includes for financial supervisors to account for these risks when they set capital requirements on the banks, both from a microprudential as well as a macroprudential viewpoint. And I just said banks, but listening to the previous panel made me remind myself that we tend to focus only in the banks when we talk about supervision, but I think there's a really big debate and action to be had on the supervision of the insurance sector with exactly that same objective. And I would hope that we also start engaging a bit more on the supervision of the commodity trading sector. And I'll stop here and would be delighted later to also say where banks stand on this.
Over to you, Judson.
Yeah, Judson Berkey, in the Chief Sustainability Office of UBS, but prior to coming into sustainability, I spent a long time in risk and regulatory activities, so I'll speak a bit more from that experience. Maybe I also have been the UBS representative in the TNFD as well. And first, I made thanks to Nature Finance for hosting this session, and I think we're incredibly lucky in Switzerland and here in Geneva to have such a leading thinker on this topic. So certainly it's something that we look to really partner with more and really make part of the core of the financial sector USP here in Switzerland. And I think Alex did a good debating trick. He basically reframed the question a little bit, so I can't disagree with him so much in terms of, should they act? Yes, of course they should act. The question is how, and so you came on to that in your second point. And I think I'll build a little bit from the last session, or the last comment in the last session about the need for really driving action and driving transition, because I think we're all sort of aligned on the basic public policy goal that we're after here, outlined by the GBF. What we really want to see is this transition story really at pace across it. So the question really is, what exactly is going to be most useful to that? And here I think there is a need to really learn from the climate experience, really applaud the NGFS for their recent conceptual framework paper. I think that's a really good initiative, to try and start to bring the conversation forward, and you're being very clear that nature risk is not a new risk type, just like climate risk was not a new risk type. We're talking about a new risk transmission channel that then plays into all the key risks that they're used to overseeing. But what I do think we shouldn't get too focused on too quickly is this attempt really to try and quantify everything, particularly you're leaping on things like climate scenario analysis and stress tests. I've heard some supervisors already say we need to start doing these in the next few years. And at least from our perspective, while that's interesting analysis and it's interesting to learn from, it's not necessarily what's driving action in the first instance. I think we should find the balance here between doing risk analysis, which is useful to understand, but actually it's that transition story that really is what has reframed the conversation within the finance sector at least. So I think that's worth reflecting on in terms of what tools and frameworks do we really want to try and use to push forward action. And then following from that is, what really is the role of a central bank and a regulator in things like transition planning for financial institutions? That's, I think, is still a live debate on climate. Very much will be a needed debate in nature as well. So I don't want to dispute the premise necessarily of action, absolutely. But I do think there's something to think through in terms of what action is most useful, what action is most appropriate, and what action is ultimately going to be in support of the broader policy objectives that we're after. Because I think you make the right point, Alex. If central banks, many instances by mandate, they have that responsibility to line up with the policy objectives set by governments, and even if not by mandate, implicitly, clearly they're part of the solution set here for driving the transition we're after.
Thanks, Judson. So, Alex, back to you to respond to that. I'd be particularly interested to hear your thoughts in response to Judson's comments on the relative use and value of scenarios and scenario planning for central banks as one of the things that you cover.
Well, I'm super happy that Judson brought that up, because I'm really concerned that we're going down into a rabbit hole in that field with regard to biodiversity. So just to put the time frame into perspective, we've had that famous speech of Mark Carney in 2015 that climate change is an issue, and it took central banks 7 years or so to start acting. I don't think we have that time to start action on broader nature issues. And therefore, I'm really concerned by seeing that, that's my impression, there are many in the room who know better, but by seeing that, for example, the work at the NGFS, which is that central bankers and supervisors network for greening the financial system with a bit more than 100 central banks and supervisors in it, that my perception is what we're doing currently are the pre steps to action, right? We're building frameworks of how to build scenarios that would allow us to diagnose the problem. And I think that's not the right way to go. And therefore, I fully agree with Judson that we need to find different approaches of how to supervise the sector. But that, for me, means taking much more forceful action, maybe with less evidence that supervisors are used to have before taking action, and also being cognizant of the fact that then banks need to play along and not basically tell supervisors, well, if you increase our capital requirements and you don't have the evidence to back it up, we'll sue you, right? Because my understanding, that's a current reason why supervisors do not act, because they fear that. So I'm all in favor of action more quickly. I think there is a need to act under uncertainty. We can't wait until we have another 10 years of data. And I would be totally in agreement with you on the need to move ahead.
Okay, well, maybe I'll pick up on what was maybe an implicit point, or maybe you meant it explicitly when you referenced capital requirements. I think that's probably a good debating point that will get things moving here. Yeah, I'll come back to you. Sort of, what are the appropriate tools for the objectives we're trying to achieve? And I'm personally not convinced. I don't think, as a financial sector yet we're convinced by the idea of using capital rules to really drive change on climate and by extension nature. And I think there are multiple ways to think that through. I mean, one is just the time frames under which capital rules have been set, which in many ways you match the tenor of our exposures. No more than a few years at best, and in the capital planning horizon, it being a few years. So this is that tragedy of the horizons that Carney spoke about before. I think one also should reflect on, you can change capital rules on banks, that's fine, but that's just a portion of where finance really comes from. Companies self-finance, there is the non-regulated sector, your market-based finance, so you can wring this stuff out of bank balance sheets if you want, but if your objective is actually transition, that doesn't necessarily get you the goal you're after. And thirdly, I think there will be, if one wants to go down the road, there will be an intense debate and discussion around that, and a little bit to your point, it essentially does lead us a bit down the rabbit hole then, and starts us into a very adversarial discussion almost, and we'll spend a lot of energy debating decimal points on capital rules, which at the end of the day, you could take most any GSIB today, and you could basically jump to zero, or you basically default all of their fossil fuel exposures, and that's not going to make much of a difference on their ultimate capital ratio right now. It's not a capital discussion. It really is a question about how are we going to work with these sectors that need to transition, and to the last debating panel, how are they being given the right signals to really realize that their future value is contingent upon change in their business strategy. And so really making sure that we have the regulatory frameworks right for the real economy sectors in some ways is, in our view, going to be the more powerful lever than trying to just adjust the capital rules on the regulated banking sector, which your earlier point, is only even a slice of the regulated financial sector, much less the unregulated financial sector.
Would you like to come back and respond briefly?
Sure, just quickly. I think whenever we talk public policy, we need to focus on a particular part in order to advance the conversation, knowing full well that there are 1,000 other policy areas where things also need to happen. So I fully agree with you. We need changes in the frameworks in the real economy. But that, for me, doesn't reduce the need to also change policy frameworks in financial markets being at the core of everything that is happening in the real economy.
Yeah, let me just offer, because I've probably been offering a lot of things about what central banks and supervisors shouldn't do, so maybe it's incumbent on me to offer some things that they should do. And absolutely, I think they should be engaging with the institutions they regulate. Absolutely, they should be trying to understand how those institutions think about nature, think about climate change, how they're integrating into their governance, how they're integrating into their strategy, what they're doing on risk management. Because also want to make sure there isn't a misunderstanding that banks haven't been thinking about this issue. In many ways, I think banks have been thinking about nature even longer than they've been thinking about climate. I don't think UBS is unique in that way. I think all of our global peers have long had policies about how they engage with certain key activities or sectors, be it forestry sector, be it the palm oil sector, be it the fishery sector. We've done that admittedly qualitatively through policies, through standards, through relying on industry certifications. Clearly there's a shift that needs to be made here to start to understand it a bit more quantitatively, thinking through the longer term scenarios, these transmission channels around transition risk and physical risks. But in some ways, your banks have been thinking about these topics. I think it's absolutely incumbent and fair and right for the regulators really to be understanding what institutions are doing and what their strategies are and how they're engaging with their clients, and ultimately what role they see for themselves in supporting this broader transition. So I think the debating point really is around how quickly to move into the area where we seem to agree on, which are these scenario analysis stress test exercises, and then also the potential role of capital requirements in driving some of the transition change that we're after.
The role of the real economy and sort of acting in tandem with central banks.
Yeah, well, there I think we're fundamentally agree that
Yeah.
it is about the real economy, because those are our clients.
Yeah.
Those are who we invest in, so their success is our success. So we have every vested interest in those companies being successful for the long term, because that's value to us too.
Yeah. We do actually have a few minutes for questions and very short comments. If we have any takers from the crowd, please raise your hand. Sorry? For all the debates. Okay. So collective questions. I feel biased in choosing Simon Zadek to ask the first question as a member of Nature Finance, but nonetheless, you're the first hand, so please.
Just filling in while other people warm up. Yeah, Simon Zadek, Nature Finance. So Alex, it would be interesting for you to just take us one step further in this journey about policy alignment. Yeah, so ignoring the question of whether it's possible or not, and maybe focusing on financial supervisors. Yeah, so those that regulate banks and other financial institutions rather than monetary policy, which is a bit more obscure for most. What would it mean that they would do in practice, given the Patrick Audier call out yesterday morning that we're at an existential moment and need to act more ambitiously? Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. To make it very concrete, I could envision financial supervisors to limit financial flows into specific activities. That can be an absolute limit. That can be what is often referred to as a concentration limit, where you say X% maximum can be lent to that sector. I could imagine that, taking up your point, Judson, on transition plans, that whether a bank or any other financial institution has a credible transition plan is then reflected in any other instrument that the supervisor imposes that can bring us back to capital requirements. I could envision, this takes us now to monetary policy again, that the central bank makes a distinction between the interest rate at which it refinances bank loans depending on where that bank stands in terms of the transition, looking at the entire balance sheet, and or depending what it refinances. So for example, acknowledging the difference in the collateral that the banks offers, and thereby to provide an incentive and a differential in the interest rate. Just quickly on that, this may sound a little bit out of the box, but actually many of the things we're thinking about that, as you suggested, Simon, go beyond the capital requirements, are been done in other fields. So Switzerland, for example, has a systemic capital buffer for the real estate sector, right? The European Central Bank does have targeted refinancing operations that refinance loans to specific sectors. This is not new stuff, right? We just have to give it a bit further thinking on how to translate that and align it with the type of objectives we're discussing here.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, in the back there, please.
I have a question with regard to the first panel. Is it okay to
Go
pose
for it.
Because the way I interpreted the discussion was that at the end there was very little disagreement about the credit as a result-based, high-quality, integer outcome. So call it a commitment rather than a credit. But I think where the discomfort, and maybe comes from, is credit implies tradability. They didn't really speak to that. I did understand that by using the same methodology, you kind of make one credit equal to the other, but that's debatable. And I missed sort of that aspect to the debate, and I would have been very interested in the two speakers' view on that issue.
Great. So we have a question about the fungibility dilemma. I think there also just my own observation about an underlying disagreement, it seemed, in perspectives in that conversation was whether or not, practically speaking, based on the experience implicitly of carbon credits, there was the actual prospect of achieving a higher integrity sort of impact governance framework for biocredits in the way that, Mariana, you were describing is the approach that needs to happen and the role of regulation, et cetera. But a skepticism about, even though that's what would need to happen for them to work, whether or not that's actually possible seemed to be another question mark. Do you want to come in, or Mark, on the fungibility question at all?
Well, I'd like to, because I think many of the reports that are dealing with these, I think, do anticipate some form of fungibility, some form of tradability of a credit. And I think that's a mistake, because nature's not fungible. And there's no way to define one global standard for what a biodiversity credit is. I think Mariana's even said in the past that, we may have hundreds of different protocols depending on the ecosystem for a biodiversity credit. So I think it's a mistake to go down the path to try to make something tradable that's fundamentally not.
Mariana?
There we go. I go back, so I think there's a lot of temptation to talk about fungibility in the way that carbon credits are fungible, because 1 ton of carbon is the same, here or in Zambia or in Colombia or anywhere. With biodiversity, that's clearly not the same. But I think the principle of everybody having to give back to nature applies, and we need a tool that facilitates that. And then also, I think the other principle that also applies is that the ecosystem services that biodiversity provides are while there's some that are global, there are others that are very localized. So it makes sense for every single country to develop projects that issue biodiversity credits and therefore facilitate that, that private sector or public sector actually contribution to biodiversity. Now, when we think about fungibility, and there might be other voices in the room that would disagree, it's how do we create a unit that is easily transferable. Not necessarily fungible because it's not the same, but that we recognize that that unit of biodiversity has certain attributes that can be comparable between different projects. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to see different credits that represent different attributes, but that if that same methodology is applied to different projects, they will represent more or less the same. I don't see a market like the carbon market where 1 ton is the same. I think that's very difficult, but I don't think that delegitimizes the fact that we can have a functioning biodiversity credit market. Is that helpful?
Thanks, Mariana. We have a comment question here, and one quickly from Helen as well, and then I think we head into final reflections. Please, sorry, this lady just before you. Could you introduce yourself too? Sorry.
Yes, Beatrice Veda Di Mauro from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I was wondering about the benefit of making the strong parallel that is being made between the climate process and nature. So one way of describing what has happened with climate, how it has become absolutely mainstream, is, as you said, the NGFS took it under its wings, and so did many other people. We've moved from describing the problem to reporting, to regulating, to pricing risk, and this is within a framework which is relatively simple. We also have a Paris Agreement, and yet we are not there at all, right? We understand there are 500 gigatons left in the budget, and yet the emissions are going up every year. So why do you take confidence that this framework would work for something which is so much more complicated, where not even really there is a clear, I mean, we have the 30 by 30, but that's not quite the same as the Paris Agreement because of the global nature of one problem, whereas the other one does not quite have the same type of global fungibility, as you were just saying. So I wish us all luck, but I don't see that this path is so productive.
Over to Helen for final comments, if you're ready.
Oh, I don't want to be the final, but no, I actually have a question for Alex. And
Brilliant.
Is that okay? No,
Please,
I'm
yes.
not talking about biodiversity credit. So given that we're in this crisis moment and business as usual is not really possible, we've surpassed 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries, and you've talked about action and changing the rules. And I'd just love for you to go a little bit more specific on what rules can change and how fast, so that we don't have to wait 7 years from this awareness that there is now. What can shift in your sectors? Thanks.
So let's take Switzerland very concretely. I think the Swiss National Bank can and must do much more in integrating climate risk analytics into the management of its 1 trillion Swiss franc balance sheet. I think the FINMA has to move and can move much faster in translating climate risk analytics into capital requirements, both on a macroprudential side as well as microprudential together with the SNB. I think the FINMA can and must move much faster in doing the same on the environment. And to come back to your point, I think we need to find different heuristics to do that and different approaches to deal with uncertainty. And I think it always helps to look at other fields in finance and what we learned from them. And one of the reports I really was interested in reading over the last few months was the report by the Federal Reserve Bank of what went wrong with Silicon Valley Bank. And you find a paragraph in there that says, basically, we saw this coming, we were uncertain, and we need to deal with that uncertainty in a much more forceful way moving forward. We can't wait as much anymore to deal with the understanding that something is going wrong and just not act because we believe we don't have the quantitative data. And I think the same applies to nature and climate, because we don't have the time to go through the same process as what we've done with climate over the last few years.
Thanks, Alex. Judson, any final comments?
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fair and right challenge. Let's just look at the facts. Carbon emissions are going up. We're not making progress. We've invested all this energy in these frameworks, and so is that really achieving the results we're after? And to think that's going to work on nature too, given all the additional complexities, I think it's absolutely the right challenge. And to me, it just highlights even more this role for public policy, economy-wide. If governments basically, give out new licenses to go drill offshore while they have a 2050 climate neutrality target, I mean that just works at cross purposes, honestly. And so unless we get to the root cause of some of these problems, I mean, it's great. Finance has a role to play, no doubt. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But if we make this a finance-only conversation, I think that's going to do the trick. We're going to be sitting here another 10 years saying, what happened?
On that note, can we please give a round of applause for our debaters? Thank them. Is this still on? Yes. Pugas, can I invite you just to share some closing reflections from someone who's part of a financial institution that's a very active participant in nature markets right now? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Wherever you'd like. Yeah, up there. Go for it.
Up here I can see better who is sleeping, who is not. So, thank you for staying till the end. I was invited to make some final considerations about this wonderful topic about Global South and Global North. So, thank you all for inviting me in. On those final reflections, I would like to take the thematics of building bridges. But before discussing how to build more bridges between Global North and Global South, I think that we really need to discuss the role of the current bridges that we have built for generations between us. And more specifically, about commercial bridges. When we talk about supply chains, investors, multinationals, the foreign investment from the Global North is on the Global South for generations. It's nothing new. We already established a lot of connections, a lot of bridges between us, but those bridges are not working for nature. On that point, I think that we must stop and not having any more double standards on nature for financing. If the Global North is ready to invest on our commodities, on our infrastructure, why not to invest in rectify the impacts of the same investments on our nature? You have to be prepared for that. Most of the times when we talk about nature finance and we talk about financing nature, climate on the Global South, obstacles such as political risks, currency volatility, and many others are on the table, but not the same happens when you talk about investing on mining sector, agricultural, or land use, or infrastructure. We are applying double standards, and we must stop as soon as possible. When we look at our commodity production, specifically in Brazil, more than 50% of our commodity production is for exporting. At the same time, when we look at the presence of the foreign sector at our tapped market, our private tapped market, through the capital markets, is less than 2%. There's a major asymmetry here. And I don't even want to start talking about the presence on the financing for nature, the role of the international financial sector on our financial natural capital in Brazil. When we look at Brazil, we host a very sophisticated financial sector, but more than that, we own a large parcel of the natural capital in the world. The same happens in Congo, the same happens in Colombia, in Indonesia. If you want to invest on nature, you can't avoid us. If you want to invest on climate and consider nature as a climate technology, you can't afford to invest on the Global South. It is not a question of how can I do, is when I will start doing that. And my answer as a financier, as soon as better. It's the best way for us to start doing that on the proper way, to create a green race, not a green rush. We need to start making it work for all the parts at the business. At the same time that we need to reinforce the local markets, the local capital markets on those places. We are the immunological system of those countries. If the foreign investor is not there, we are still there. No one knows better how we work than the ones that are on the ground. So I truly understand when someone from the Global North wants to make direct investments in the Global South, but do not ignore the local players. It's the best way not to drive the true impact, but also to reinforce the local landscape to make and sustain the transformation that we are trying to bring. Brazil is doing our part. We are discussing our taxonomy, the green taxonomy, a very robust one, is on public consultation. We are already discussing our cap and trade system. Our compliance carbon market is under discussion and voting, probably to be voted to COP in Dubai. We are doing our homework, at least on nature. But after so many hard years, as a pariah, it's great to return to our former glory on the nature discussions. But more than that, we know that we are doing our homework, but we need to improve, we need to level the current breaches, because it will not work if we don't start doing so. We need to start talking about blended finance as a common language between Global North and Global South. We had to use the supply chains that connect us. We need to start discussing very seriously the co-responsibilities that the Global North and Global South has in managing the impact caused by the trades that we are already in place. We totally understand when a Swiss company announced to be regenerative. We just can't understand when a Swiss company or any other company that is producing chocolate or any other product can affirm to be carbon neutral or regenerative if they are not financing the transition of the supply chains in the Global South. As far as I know, cocoa is not produced on the Swiss Alps yet. And finally, in our opinion, in my humble opinion, I think that we need to start discussing our present before we start discussing our future. It's not a question of charity, it's a question of responsibility. You can count on the Global South. We have done a lot of things, not necessarily with the Global North, but we can do much better if you are together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pugos, and just an additional thank you for your leadership as an institution and an individual on aligning finance with more equitable and nature-positive outcomes. We really appreciate you. And now, to another amazing leader who has helped to seed not only nature finance, but probably the entire sustainability ecosystem within civil society in Switzerland, and is also a Task Force on Nature Markets member. We'll hear some final reflections from Andre Hoffmann. Thank you. You took a while to walk up here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Nature Finance who have invited me. Thank you very much to have been allowed to be a member of the Task Force on Nature Market, an experience that I really liked. And perhaps allow me some short remark. I'm just folding in. I'm just falling into the philanthropist trap. You know, you're the one who talks at the end. How can I sum up the incredible amount of knowledge and expertise you have just heard? I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to say that I would like to remind us why are we trying to put some value on nature. I think it's very important to really understand that we do need a systemic change. We do need a way of trying to construct a system which will bring us to a different level. And if I could, just as a parting shot for the last minute, try to share some sort of vision of what the future could look like. I think that, you know, we have created with the existing systems a prosperity that works. We have 10 million people on the planet, and these 10 million people are living healthier and better and longer and better educated than they ever have before. But it's not going to allow us to do that in the long term because it is not sustainable. So we need to create a new system which will allow us to reach the sustainable, just prosperity that we are all looking for, the inclusive, sustainable prosperity. And for this I have a vision, and that vision is very simple. Here we are in an oil-based economy. That oil-based economy has allowed us the prosperity I just mentioned, but it is cracking up. We are now moving towards a data economy where we are going to be able to use the new technologies that were referred to several times today during the conversation. And this data economy will allow us to have more information than ever about nature. And now the vision should be the move to a nature economy. Let's give nature the real value, let's give nature the real underlying asset capacity that it should have for the globe to continue to exist. That will bring us back in the planetary limits, and that will reintroduce the different justice element that we are missing. You know, the places where nature is rife are the poorest nation on earth, and this will be a way of starting a just retribution. So there we go. That's all I had to say. Thank you very much for coming, and yeah, good luck to all of us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andre. And that does conclude our program for this evening. If you want to learn more, we really encourage you to go to the Task Force on Nature Markets website, read the report, get in touch with us, go have a drink. Thanks to everybody.